So what we're going to talk about is what I have planned today. Is going to go over the whole life of King David. But what we're going to see is, we're going to see that King David's life was promised something, and that it took a long time, and he had to go through a lot before he actually got there. And what we're going to see is that, especially when it came to a certain person, King David was treated very badly. And what we're going to talk about is, how does that correlate to us when people treat us badly? What can we learn from King David? And what can we learn when we feel like God has promised us something, but yet it feels like it's just not coming true? So to start off, we're going to start with David, just David, as a young teen watching sheep. What we see is that Saul, the king of Israel, has been rejected by God. God has said, "You will no longer be king. I will not establish a kingdom with your seed, and instead someone else will." So he's told to go to Bethlehem, where he comes across a man named Jesse. Jesse brings forth his sons, but Samuel, who's to anoint the king, says that none of them are it. Finally, David's presented. And in 1 Samuel 16:12, this is what happens. "And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and withal and beautiful countenance, and goodly to look at. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went around." While it's unsure exactly how old David is, everyone can agree that he's somewhere in his teens. Some speculate anywhere from 13 to 17, although it's not sure. David has just been promised that he will be the next king of Israel. What David doesn't know is that it's going to be a long journey. If we go into the next chapter in the 1 Samuel 17, we see that the Israelites are in battle, and that all of David's brothers are out fighting except for him. He's forced to stay home and watch the flock of sheep. When he's finally sent to give his brother food, he sees that a giant Philistine is terrorizing the whole Israel army. When he asks why no one will fight him, they say they're too scared. David says, "God is on my side, I will fight him." And so in 1 Samuel 17:49, "And David put his hand in the bag, and took there's a stone, and sling it, and smote the Philistine in the forehead. And the stone sunk in his forehead, and he fell upon the face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and smote the Philistine, and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran, stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath. Therefore he slew him, and cut his head therewith. And the Philistines saw their champion dead, they fled." We see the first victory in battle that David would become, and he would have many more. This would lead to, in chapter 18, David would become promoted. In chapter 18, verse 1, "And it came to pass, when he made in the speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would not let him go no more to his home, to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, and gave it to David, and the garments, even his sword, his bow, and his girdle. And David went whither so Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. Saul sent him over the men of war, and was accepted in the sight of all people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." What we see right here is that Saul has accepted David to be a champion. Jonathan, Saul's son, will also become David's best friend. Now, this is David's first real test of how life won't be fair. David meets this young man named Jonathan. Jonathan is never described poorly in the Bible. David describes him as being a good guy. And Jonathan and him become great friends. I wonder what David felt like when he met Jonathan and realized what Jonathan's fate was. That Jonathan had the rightful throne to be next in throne, but he never would. In fact, David probably knew that Jonathan was going to die young. I think about this because this is the first time where David has a chance to say, this isn't fair. This is wrong. That this man right here should be king, but instead he'll be punished because of his father. But David understood that God had a bigger plan and that there was a reason for it. We also see David could have taken this opportunity to think himself higher and better than Jonathan. He could have said, oh, look, you're supposed to be king, but God anointed me. I'm going to be king. That makes me better than you. Which brings us to our first lesson that David's going to teach us today. And that is the simple fact that we are no better than anyone around us. We have this common misconception that because we're saved, we're God's chosen people. And yes, we are saved. And yes, God has chosen us for something. But it doesn't make us any better than those around us. We see in the New Testament, it says all have sinned. It doesn't say 95%, 90%, half. It says all of us. We think we deserve to go to heaven. We think we deserve God to treat us good because we're followers of Him. The only thing we ever deserved was hell. We don't deserve heaven. We don't deserve anything good God's ever given us. God gives us that because He wants to. And so we see that David has this humbleness about him that he shows with Jonathan. Maybe that's why he goes so keen to Jonathan. Maybe he actually feels bad for him. Whatever it is, we should take note of that. And we should take note that there's a lost world out there. And that we shouldn't think of ourselves better than it. We should think of ourselves as having a way of finding a way out. But we also see that with David's acceptance of Israel and Israel accepting him, the trouble truly begins for David. In the next verse, verse 6, and it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tabrets with joy and instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth with the sayings, displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed until David's 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hands, and at other times there was a javelin in Saul's hands. And Saul cast a javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall. And David avoided his presence twice. So what we see is David just went from being praised by Saul to now, I'm going to kill him. And this is one of the things where we can see that David's life starts to go on what looks like a downhill track. We see that David sent on suicide missions from Saul, all from which he returned victorious. We see that Saul eventually tries to kill David twice. Eventually, Jonathan, the king's son, has to tell David that you need to get out. And Jonathan helps David escape, where David spends many years on the run. But here's the question. What was David's reaction to all of this? David's reaction was not one of anger, of mad. He acted like this. In verses 18 through 14, And David behaved himself wisely in all the ways the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all of Israel and Judea loved David, because he went out and came in before them. Which brings us to the next things that we learn from King David in his life at this moment. When you act goodly, even when those are acting bad to you, they'll notice. They'll take note of how you act. Saul becomes afraid of David. Why? Saul knew that the Lord was with David. Those that would try to do you wrongly, they will understand that you have something with you that they don't have. And it may scare them. They may realize that maybe you can actually triumph them. As we skip more into David's life, we see what should be a great victory in his life. And that is in 1 Samuel 31, verses 1 through 6. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and fell down and slain in Mount Gilead. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul, and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan, Abinadab, Meshullam, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. And so then Saul said unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, thrust me therewith, lest the uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all of his men that same day together. This day should be a great day for victory. With Saul's death, David is no longer on the run. The king no longer wants him dead, and now David can take the kingdom that God has promised him. But keep in mind, Jonathan also died. David should become king, but his best friend, he will also have to mourn for him. Once again, just another thing to put in the way of David being happy about his king. But David doesn't become king just yet. As we see, a man becomes king before David. But Immer, the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ismael, son of Saul, and brought him over to Miriam, and made him king over Galilee, and over the Asherites, over the Jezreel, over Ephraim, Benjamin, and over all of Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and reigned 2 years. But the house of Judea followed David. And at the time David was king in Hebron over the house of Judea was 7 years and 6 months. Once again, just another hurdle to make David delay being king. In fact, it's not until 3 chapters later that David does become king. And there's a very important thing to look at this verse. In 2 Samuel 5:3, so all the elders of Israel came to the king of Hebron and King David and made a league with him in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judea 7 years, 6 months. In Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all of Israel and Judea. It took about 15 years, depending on how old David was when he was promised, to finally become king. That takes a lot of patience to be hunted down, a lot of patience to have an entire country that you're supposed to rule actually trying to kill you. You're told that you are going to become king of this nation, and instead you're being hunted down. David never gave up, even though it would take 15 years. But here comes the next lesson in David's life. We can look at this as God's promise was finally fulfilled to David. But did that mean that David's problems were completely over? No. See, David still fought wars. David still dealt with rebellions. At one point, he was actually even kicked out of Jerusalem by his son who led rebellion against him. And we have this thought process, especially when we're talking to new believers, that's wrong. We tell new believers that sometimes when you become a Christian, all of your problems go away. And that is far from true. We'll go later on into this, but we'll find out where Jesus actually says the exact opposite. He doesn't say all your problems will go away. He says that He'll stand with you, and He'll stand through you with your problems. See, sometimes David felt problems because they were punishments for him. Sometimes they were just life. But David never blamed God for a single problem. In fact, if we go to his most famous following of Bathsheba, in 2 Samuel 12:19, we see that David's finally told that his son is dead. That's a horrible thing to go through, to think that your son, your newborn son, has just died. But David, even though this may have been one of the worst things he dealt with, never blamed God. He said, God, it's your will, it's what you put before me, and so I will take it. As we get to the end of David's life in 2 Samuel 24:8-9, we see that a census has been gone throughout the land to count up David's kingdom. And this is what we read. So when they have gone through all the land, they came to Jerusalem, and at the end of 9 months and 20 days, and Joab gave the sum number of people unto the king. And there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword, and the men in Judea were 500,000. What we see is King David's promise came true. That shepherd who was left home to fight, left over the sheep while his brothers fought the war, that young boy who was looked over by his father to be the king, is now king over a decent-sized country. That is just the fighting men to think about. How did David get through it? We see in Psalms 27, David gives us just a small glimpse into how he did it. A psalm of David, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Whom shall I be afraid of? When the wicked, even my enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat my flesh, they stumble and fell. Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall fear not. Though war should raise against me, in this I will be confident. In this we see that David admits he had problems. He had wars. He had people who wanted him dead, who were trying to hunt him down. But what he said is that God was his salvation. The Lord was his strength. That's how he got through it, by giving his life to God, by trusting God. And as we know, even though many tried, no one ever defeated David. So, how does this morally correlate to us? Well, the first thing to understand is that what I said earlier. The Christian life is something that was not supposed to be easy. If you read we read in John 15-18, Jesus says this: If the world hate you, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of this world, I have chosen you out of the world, therefore it hated you. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If he have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If you have kept my sayings, they will keep yours also. So, what is this saying? What this saying is that the whole world persecuted Jesus while he was here. Why should we think that we're going to be treated any different? If the world didn't accept Jesus, why would it accept us? You know, it seems scary to think that. But Matthew 16-22, Jesus says this: Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But be aware of men, for they will deliver you up into the councils, and they will scourge you in the synagogues. And ye shall be brought before the governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, take no thought of how or what ye shall speak, for it shall be given to you in that hour which you speak. For it is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. And the brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child, and the children shall rise against their parents, and cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But he that endureth in the end shall be saved. What we see from here is that Jesus gives the disciples, as he's talking to them, he gives them kind of things that will happen to them. He says, you know, you're going to be brought before judges, and they're going to try and persecute you. The synagogues will persecute you. But he also gives them some hope. He tells them that he's going to be with them. He'll never leave them, that Jesus will stay with them, God will be with them. And in the end, if they endure, they shall be saved. Whether they are saved in this life or the next life, they will be saved. And no matter what happens to you on this earth, he reminds them that there is nothing that can compare to the glory of heaven. In Luke 22 and 23, Jesus also tells this, "Blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice ye in that day, and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. For in the like manner did your fathers unto the prophets." Jesus reminds them that heaven is the end goal. And he also reminds them here that the prophets that they looked up to, the prophets weren't treated all that good either. Some were killed, some were looked down upon, some were seen as crazy men just because they said things that the people didn't like to hear. So, if the world is going to hate us, as Jesus says, then what should be our response? Well, we can look at David and see how he reacted from the same hatred from Saul. And we see in 1 Samuel 24, 3 through 7. David's on the run, and Saul is hunting him down. They come into a cave, and this is what happens. "And he came into the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and Saul went to cover his feet. And David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thy enemy into thy hand, and thou mayst do with him as shall she good to thee. Then David arose, cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privately, and it came to pass afterwards that David's heart smote him, because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And he said unto his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master. The Lord's anointed to stretch forth my hand against him, seeing that he is anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants with these words, and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose out of the cave and went his way." What we see is David had an opportunity to end all of his struggles by killing Saul. But David said, "No, I won't." Why did David say no? We go down to verse 12, we see why. David and Saul were talking, and this is what David says. "The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but thy hand shall not be upon thee. As saith the proverb of the ancients, wickedness produced from the wicked, but my hand shall not be upon thee." David understands that it wasn't his place. It wasn't his place to kill Saul. That God had promised him something, and so he was going to trust it was going to come true. He also says at the end, wickedness produced from wickedness. David understands that by murdering Saul, he will become what he is trying to get rid of from Saul. We see that later on, 2 chapters later, that David has another point, that he can kill Saul. Even though, once again, David's men say do it, he does not do it. And Saul's reaction to the sparing is one that we should take note of. In 1 Samuel 24, 16 through 22, "And it came to pass, when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is that thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I rewarded thee evil. And thou hast shown me this day how that thou hast dealt well with me, for as much as when the Lord hath delivered me into thy hand, thou killest me not. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore the Lord rewarded thee good for that thou hast done unto me this day. And behold, I know well thou shalt surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in thine hand. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and thou wilt not destroy my name of my father's house. And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men gat into the hold. What we see, Saul's reaction, Saul knows David's right. Saul knows David will win, because Saul knows David is blessed by God. He even begs before David. What does this mean for us? Well, like we said earlier, people will notice. People will notice that there's something different about you. The devil will try to keep us down, just as Saul did to David. And even though Saul says this all, this is before the second time that David spared Saul. So it didn't stop Saul. Just as the devil won't stop, even though the devil already knows he's lost. Why? Because his plan is, if I can't win, I'll take as many down with me as possible. So let us not be taken over that. So what does Jesus say of how we should react to this hatred? Well, Matthew 5:43, ye have heard that it said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and thine enemy, and hate thy enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good unto them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the just. What we see is that Jesus says you're supposed to love them. That's a hard thing to do. It's hard to love those who are treating you badly. But why do we have to love those and treat those good who treat us badly? Well, Jesus says this in Luke. But I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them which hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. And unto him that smiteth thee on one cheek, offer also the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy cloak also. Give to every man that asketh of thee, and of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. And as ye would that men should do to you, do also to them likewise. For if you love them which love you, what thank have ye? For sinners also love them that love them. And if ye do good to them which do good to you, what thank have ye? For sinners do even the same. And if you lend to them who hope to receive, what thank have ye? For sinners also lend to sinners, to receive as much again. But love ye your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again. And your reward shall be great, and ye shall be children of the highest, for he is kind unto even the unthankful and the evil. What is it saying? It says, what good does it do to do good What good does it do to do good that do good to you? That's easy. It's far too easy to be nice to those who are nice to you. And while it's a shame to say, some people can't even do that. But God says that we're different. God says it takes more to be good to those who are cruel to you. But yet, is this not the image that Jesus set before us? That even on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them? Is it not that our sins put him on the cross to begin with, but yet he's good to us? So, when people are cruel to us, we get this idea of being vengeance. But what should we do with our vengeance? Well, Paul tells us exactly what to do in Romans with our vengeance. Bless them which persecute you. Bless and curse not. Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. Be of the same mind one towards another. Mind not the high things, but concede them to the men of low state. Be not wise in your own counsels. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourself, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thy enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head, but not overcome evil with overcome evil with good. You know, what we see here is what David told Saul. David told Saul, I could kill you, I could get my vengeance, but my vengeance is not for me. The vengeance is for God. God will repay what God has told to repay. We also see that being nice to those who cruel you will actually drive them crazy. Why? Because they want to see you react in a way that will make them pleased. But being nice to them, not reacting, doesn't give them that joy. So, why do we go over this? Why is this important to remember? Why is this repeated so many times in the Bible? Well, the answer is very simple. We're not going to change the world through hate. No one's going to come to a group that despises them. No, we don't accept sin, but we don't also hate the person. We have this idea that if we separate ourselves and that if we make our own little group and that we only like those in our group and those that like us, that somehow the world will change. The problem is, while we're locked away in our groups only with ourselves and not trying to venture out and loving those, even though those that hate us, the world is out there and is doing its bidding. The world does not care what group you're in. The devil will go for anyone and everyone. We have been given this task of being different. And there's an opportunity to show the love of God to someone when they're mean and despiteful to you. And what if your kind actions was the actions that would make them realize that there is more to life, that God is real, that maybe they've been treated badly by Christians before, but maybe that's not what Jesus is actually about. There's something actually more. As for the feelings of that God has promised me something, and yet it doesn't come true, I want us to be reminded that King David waited a long time. And there's also something else that I find very, very funny when you read the First and Second Kings. When you read throughout First and Second Kings, you see something that God keeps repeating over and over again. Usually, it's when the kings are behaving badly. See, God made a covenant with David that his seed would reign Israel and that his seed would save men. But his seed didn't always behave and didn't always do what they're supposed to do. And many times we see God say this: you are behaving badly, and I would destroy you, I would destroy your seed, if not for the covenant I made with my servant David. God kept that promise. Even though even though his seed wasn't always the best, God kept a promise with David. God will keep his promise with you. But first, we must always remind ourselves that we must show the love of God to everyone.